the infiltration of the institutions. How did this get to the business sector?
The late 19th century in Baltimore with the founding of Johns Hopkins University. It starts with Richard Ely, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and his student, Woodrow Wilson, who was a PhD candidate under Ely, who obviously went on to become President of the United States and the godfather of American public administration. It is a story of two very powerful philosophical streams that focused on taking over the institutions of the West, primarily the cultural institutions, education, religion, entertainment, etc., and then eventually worked their way around to American business and began the process earnestly during the 1970s and effectively took over business within the last decade.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I'm sure you've all seen the news. Gina Carano has been censored by Disney. She was one of the big stars in the show The Mandalorian. And this is raising one of the big issues of woke capitalism. Big businesses censoring individuals, censoring users, censoring customers for the sake of their social justice interests. Now, here to speak with us is Stephen Soukup. He's the author of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, and that's how political correctness captured big business, explaining to us the history of how all this stuff happened. Hey, Stephen, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I guess just first question, you talk about, you started writing this book a year ago. And this was before we saw, Facebook and YouTube starting to kick off, censoring the president at the time, President Donald Trump.
Yes.
Censoring him, deleting tweets, you name it, kicking off Parler from services like Amazon Web Services. You really had, I think, you were pretty far ahead of the curve with getting into this. But I know a lot of your work has focused on this for many years, and I know you've been studying this. You talk about this as a century-long issue of the infiltration of the institutions. How did this get to the business sector?
Well, it is a long story. It is a fascinating story, and essentially it starts in earnest in the late 19th century in Baltimore with the founding of Johns Hopkins University. It starts with Richard Ely, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and his student, Woodrow Wilson, who was a PhD candidate under Ely, who obviously went on to become President of the United States and the godfather of American public administration. It is a story of two very powerful philosophical streams that began in different parts of the world, but yet met in the United States in the late 1960s, that focused on taking over the institutions of the West, primarily the cultural institutions, education, religion, entertainment, etc., and then eventually worked their way around to American business and began the process probably most earnestly during the 1970s and effectively took over business within the last decade.
Now, it's a bizarre relationship because what we see a lot on the left is that really, of course, there's still moderates and, very reasonable people and people who genuinely believe in social justice and values and things like this. But there's a very radical element that does advocate for socialism or even communism these days. And a lot of these people tend to oppose big business, but now we see big business aligning itself with them. And even if you look at the sponsors and the movements they have, oftentimes big business goes hand in hand with it. It seems counterintuitive. Now, on the business side, why are they doing this? Why are they, selling the noose to hang themselves, so to speak? What's really going on here?
Well, they don't believe that they are. They believe that they are in control. If you look at the news over the last week or so, you'll see that Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world, believes that he's running the sustainability game within American business, that he's in charge, that he gives the orders, that companies will meet the standards he wants them to meet, and that he has the ability, therefore, to tell the government to back off, to tell the Biden administration and its appointees at the SEC not to issue new sustainability reporting standards, that they've got this all under control and they'll take care of it. So I think that business does not see themselves, a lot of big business at least, does not see themselves as threatened by government. They think that they're running this game, and they will learn eventually that they're not.
Well, we recently saw reports from China where one of the individuals within Xi Jinping's brain trust, the head of the Chinese Communist Party's brain trust, in other words, not a minor individual, someone who advises the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party, actually came out and did a video, and people were clapping, and he was bragging about it, claiming that China is able to basically influence and control American politics through the influence in the financial institutions. And when you get into business as well, understand a lot of the narratives we have in social justice are promoted by the big media, and almost all these big media are under very large corporate structures, very large corporate institutions, about 6 corporations controlling just about all of them. And it's interesting to watch them promote these narratives because they're the ones driving the narratives, while at the same time the institutions behind them are influencing politics. I mean, how intertwined is this game? And on the, say, finance side of it, what would you say the real goal is here?
The finance side of it, the goal is primarily to dominate the markets. As I mentioned before, BlackRock is the largest asset management firm on the planet. They have almost $9 trillion in assets under management, and it increases considerably every year. They have expanded their operations in China. They've expanded their business with China, and they continue to push for greater and greater control of the companies that are in their realm. And as a passive management firm, that means all companies, all of the S&P 500 is owned by BlackRock because it runs these ETFs, these index funds, which gives them ownership over all of this using its investors' money. This is not Larry Fink's money. This is not BlackRock's money. It's your money. It's my money. It's the guy who invests in his 401k at work, the guy who invests in his IRA. It's their money that BlackRock is using to control the market and to try to impose its beliefs about where business should go and how it should operate politically. It's our money that they're using to impose their will on the markets and essentially on the American people.
One thing you talk about in your book is, these kind of keywords like SRI, social responsible investment. You get into the business and ecological type investment. So what is it? Business, sociology, and ecology, or environmentalism, things like this. And you also talk about these utopian investors, that they're not necessarily, they're doing things that you think would be counterintuitive for smart business investment. We've seen how Facebook and, for example, Twitter censoring people and how their markets just took major hits afterwards, doing things that don't seem rational from a business standpoint for the support of these social justice policies. But what you talk about in your book isn't just the surface business element. You talk about the investor element in it, and that maybe some of the investors actually want this, even if it's bad for investment. I mean, how does this whole thing work?
Well, the social investment movement is probably about 30 to 35 years old, and it began on college campuses with students who were upset with their universities having investments in South Africa. And they asked the administrators of their universities' investments to divest from South Africa. That was a very easy, very simple idea. But out of that grew this idea that investment policies should be socially responsible or could be socially responsible. And for the first, say, 20, 25 years, it was a perfectly amicable relationship. If you didn't want to be invested in oil companies, then you created screens with your advisor, or your advisor created screens for you that kept oil companies or petroleum companies of any sort out of your portfolio. Within the last 10 years or so, though, the new version of socially responsible investing, which goes by the initials ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance, began to be slightly more aggressive and has grown more and more aggressive as time has gone by. Whereas formerly, social investment was about avoiding companies that clash with your values. Now it's about changing companies. Now it's about forcing companies to align with your values. And once you hit a critical mass of investors, and we're not talking about normal, average, everyday people, but investors at the high end, professional investors who believe in certain public ideas, then they can impose their will through the shareholder proposal and shareholder proxy process to change the way companies behave, to change their boards of directors, to change their management, to force policy changes on them. And this has become sort of the de facto way to achieve social ends within this community of professional investors who have moved significantly to the left over the past quarter century.
Now, you talked about in your book how a lot of government officials have tried to address the issue of big business censorship, but you mentioned they're kind of looking in the wrong places, that they're kind of missing the real picture here. What is the real picture, and how could they actually deal with this?
The problem is that this is a very complicated issue. And every time you peel one layer, you discover another layer underneath. It's the old onion analogy. It's a very complicated, very difficult to follow issue. And most of our elected officials are only just now waking up to the reality of what's going on. For example, if you're upset with Apple removing Parler from its App Store, your reaction is to say, hey, wait a minute, they're censoring us. Why is Apple censoring us? Well, they're against Parler, they're against conservatives. But the fact of the matter is that Apple has built its entire empire over the last 20 years with a deep involvement in the People's Republic of China, with a powerful connection to the Chinese Communist Party, and is unable to distinguish itself in many ways from the policies and the beliefs of the Chinese Communist Party. And so Apple is not merely a company, an American media company that opposes conservative views. Apple is very heavily invested in the PRC, and the PRC is very heavily invested in Apple. And so you have this massive web of financial and personal connections that most of the people in elected office are either unaware of or unable to dedicate a whole lot of time to following and to understanding completely.
This China angle is a big deal. A lot of my work has been researching the Chinese Communist Party as well.
Sure.
Now, you talk about how big businesses like Apple have to follow the directives of the Chinese Communist Party because if they violate them, they risk their business interests in China.
Yep.
We were talking about Disney earlier and some of their censorship policies. Actually, I remember reading the different requirements that the Chinese Communist Party places on the film industry. I mean, and people might be shocked. You have to support core socialist values. You cannot show the Chinese Communist Party or Chinese police in a negative light. You cannot show the United States in a positive light. You have to, for example, include certain numbers of, if you want to have it broadcast in China, certain number of Chinese actors, certain number of scenes in China. And you also have to kind of overemphasize the catering to the CCP or co-produce the films with the Chinese Communist Party in order to ensure you even have access to their market. And even if you're not playing a broadcast there, if you violate their rules, you don't get back in, especially if you're an actor. And so
Yeah, absolutely.
the degree to which China can control business, corporations, finance, entertainment in the United States because of this intertwining relationship. It's a huge deal. Now, I think you have some interesting insights on how the finance element of this works because we all saw the headlines on this, but really the details of it kind of go over our heads. When China came out, when this guy with the Xi Jinping's brain trust came out and said they can control American politics through finance, I mean, in your understanding of what you've seen, how does that actually work?
Well, there are a number of different ways that it works. You mentioned Disney at the beginning of our conversation, and you just mentioned them again. One way that they affect the culture, which is downstream, and politics is downstream from culture, is through the rules placed on various production companies. When Disney advertised Star Wars films in China, John Boyega, who is a person of color, an actor of color, was removed from or moved to the background of the Chinese versions of the movie posters because the Chinese did not want him front and center. When Disney produced Marvel's Doctor Strange, the Ancient One, who is a Tibetan monk in the comics, suddenly becomes a middle-aged Englishwoman because the Chinese did not want a Tibetan monk to play a heroic part in this movie, and Disney went along with it. In the credits to Mulan, which was filmed in China, Disney thanks the provincial government of Xinjiang province, which is where all the Uyghurs are kept in these concentration camps. So essentially, what you have is a company that is in control of a great deal of American media and that dominates American culture, bowing to the Chinese over and over and over again, and allowing them to make decisions for what Americans will see and what Americans will be able to purchase tickets to see, and what their $5 a month for Disney Plus will go to. So this is a very significant issue with respect to the entertainment industry and Disney in particular. There are also aspects of this, as I mentioned, with financial companies that are trying to expand their business in China, that are trying to expand their business with Chinese companies. For a long time, BlackRock, as I mentioned, was the largest shareholder of PetroChina, which is the Chinese, the listed arm of the Chinese National Petroleum Company, which back in 2000 was the subject of a considerable number of scathing articles because it supported the regime in Sudan that was practicing black slavery, modern day black slavery. They were trading slaves, and PetroChina was funding that regime. And so there's an entire, saying it's a web of influence would not do it credit. There's several webs of influence, and it all works out to the CCP's favor.
Now, one thing I found very kind of shocking is you did talk about BlackRock Capital in your book. I believe like $7 trillion in assets. They're not small players, and that they were put in charge partly of a lot of these virus programs in terms of how we have to wear masks and stuff like this, that this big capital firm intertwined with China was given some control over these policies. Could you explain to us how this happened?
Well, the last spring, when the markets crashed in response to the initial breakout of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury wanted to implement several programs to help stabilize the markets, to help stabilize business, to help American corporations rebound from what was a tremendous shock. But the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department do not have the capacity to run these programs. So essentially they have to outsource them, and they outsourced a great deal of them to BlackRock. And there are videos of President Trump talking about how wonderful and how smart Larry Fink is and how important it is for Larry Fink to be on board and to be running these programs for the American people, while at the same time, Larry Fink is promising that he will expand his business in China, that he thinks China is a new frontier for the investment markets, and that he is going to impose upon American businesses a sustainability standard that he believes is necessary to avert climate disaster. So you have what is clearly a conflict of interest based on the United States government's desperation to have some help in administering programs that it felt was necessary in the wake of the market collapse last spring.
For anyone following China, I mean, this is deeply concerning in a few different ways. One, because the model for dealing with the virus, the lockdowns, the mask mandates, even a lot of the economic programs, have been based on the Chinese Communist Party's model, and the effectiveness of those systems has been based heavily on Chinese Communist Party disinformation. And so we see them implementing these policies that are part of the China model without looking at really the proof of whether they actually are effective, while at the same time talking about the economic rebound being based on the China model. And now we find out the group put in charge of a lot of this is deeply intertwined with the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, that's absolutely true. And it's not just BlackRock. It's all, probably not fair to say all, but most large American financial services firms are deeply intertwined with China because they believe, and I suppose rightly so, that this is a very large untapped market. They choose to ignore, of course, when they talk about this untapped market, that it's also historically manifestly corrupt, and that their efforts there depend wholly on the goodwill of the CCP and its willingness to continue to participate with them.
There's been another concerning development when it comes to a lot of this. Now, President Joe Biden, got rid of the policy that would forbid the Chinese Communist Party from controlling the American electric grid. He's talking about Build Back Better. They're talking about these green programs. The people with BlackRock, as you mentioned, were talking about these new environmental standards. What a lot of people, I think, miss in this discussion is that the Chinese Communist Party controls a lot of the green energy market. And the question is, if we've removed the policies that would forbid them from controlling our electric grid, while at the same time working with companies that work on investment deeply tied to China, meaning they're interested in working with these companies as well, very likely, while at the same time implementing policies that would almost mandate, in some cases, the building of these systems, where are we heading?
I think we're headed for a mess. If you recall, early last summer, just after the crash, just after it became clear what we were dealing with and how it got here and who it was who deceived the world as to the origins and the extent of the problem, there was a lot of talk, particularly among medium to large American business, about decoupling, especially decoupling supply lines from China. And over the course of probably the last, say, 6 or 7 months, all of that talk of decoupling has essentially disappeared. I don't know that I believe that President Trump's trade policies were necessarily the most effective way to affect the CCP's behavior, but certainly he got the regime's attention and made sure that they understood that we were willing at least to fight back in whatever way we could against their broader global ambitions. The public sentiment among business owners in the wake of the initial round of the pandemic was very similar to President Trump's, that we needed to take action to protect ourselves, at the very least, if not to punish, at least to protect ourselves going forward from something similar or something more severe emanating from the PRC. And as I say, over the last 6 months, that's sort of faded away. And the intertwined nature of our financial services and a lot of our big businesses with the Chinese government has probably accelerated, if anything, over the past few months, rather than decelerated or begun the process of decoupling. So we're definitely in up to our necks with the Chinese Communist Party, and at this point, or at some point in the near future, we're relying almost entirely on their goodwill, which, when dealing with the CCP, their goodwill is not something you want to be dependent upon.
Great. So just for our viewers again, this book is The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, and that's how political correctness captured big business. And Stephen, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.